point I want to make to start off our CLE is the critical nature of your analysis in these cases where your client is charged with driving on the revoked list. And it may be as a result of a DWI, because there's mandatory jail, even if it never makes it out of municipal court. If your client gets found guilty of it, he has to go to jail, all right? And I think it's between, 10 and 90 days, something of that nature. And if it's under certain circumstances, it can also be an indictable offense, 2C40-26, a crime in the fourth degree, which, as you all know, has a mandatory 6 months incarceration, which is not subject to early release or parole eligibility. You got to serve every day of the 180 days. So there's a lot going on here, a lot of jeopardy for your client. And the problem that's come up, and this is what we're going to try to resolve today, is that there's case law on this, which makes it very confusing when you're looking at an abstract to figure out whether or not your client is going to be subject to prosecution. And as confusing as it is, the prosecutors looking at it both on the municipal level and on the superior court level, they may not understand how to do it as well. So our whole purpose today is to go through this, go through the case law, and sense out of what can be a very, very confusing situation. Well, after you're done today, though, you guys will not be confused at all. You're going to understand it, and I hope you'll be in a better position to explain it to prosecutors and judges when the time comes. All right. The starting point for our analysis is in 39-340, and right in the very beginning of the 340 statute, which gives the general elements of the offense of driving on the revoked list. And the reason this is so important, because you'll see 2C40-26 actually borrows the elements of the 39-340 as one of the things that has to be proved by the state during a 2C40-26 prosecution, okay? So let's look at the element that we're going to have to focus on today and see how the case law treats it. So 39-340 says, no person to whom a driver's license has been refused, which would be somebody who made an application, but they turned you down because of medical reasons or, some other purpose. You're just not a person that's fit to be a driver for some reason. The director of the motor vehicles can refuse you for that purpose, or whose license or reciprocity privilege has been suspended or revoked, and there's really no difference between those two as a practical matter, or has been prohibited from obtaining a license, and here's the key, shall personally operate a motor vehicle during the period of refusal, suspension, revocation, or prohibition. So the key thing that you have to focus on is this concept of during the period of refusal, suspension, or revocation. In other words, driving during a time period that you are putatively on the revoked list. That's what the problem is here, and that's the element we're going to really drill down on today, because it's going to make all the difference for your client as we go forward. You take a look at 2C40-26. It has two sections to it, an A and a B. The A very seldom, if ever, gets charged. It's really more of a motor vehicle type situation, but it's motor vehicle handled on the criminal side. And notice that the legislature picks up the 39-340 elements exactly the same thing. They just cite the statute. It's a crime of the fourth degree to operate a motor vehicle during a period of suspension in violation of 39-340. Exactly the same language. Again, during the period of license suspension. They don't use revocation or refusal or other prohibition in the language here. They just take it to say license suspension. And in the B section, this is the one that puts you in jail for 6 months. Again, crime of the fourth degree to operate a motor vehicle during the period of license suspension in violation of 39-340. So the key is they've got to prove you guilty of the 39-340 as a foundation for prosecution in the criminal matter, okay? Now, as we'll see in the case law, the Appellate Division regards 39-340 as a lesser included offense of the fourth degree crime. So God forbid your client is convicted of the 2C40-26, either A or B. The driving on the revoked list should properly merge as a lesser included offense. And we'll talk about that down the line a little bit. But I want everybody to be really focused on the language we're going to be discussing and what comes up through the case. Now, there are various permutations that are going to come out of this on your client driving abstract, okay? And I want to just give you the four possibilities that we'll be discussing today. These are how they come out. The first one, for number A here in your lesson plan, an easy call and a cascading mess. And this occurs when your client is personally operating a motor vehicle during the determinate term of a license suspension ordered by the court for drunk driving or for refusal, okay? And by the way, refusal and DWI, the suspensions that you get are equally important. I'm just going to say DWI I say DWI suspension, I'm also including, by implication, refusal suspensions too, because you get the same liability for driving on a revoked list for a refusal as you do for the DWI. There's really no difference between them for purposes of the statutes we're going to be talking about. So let's say that your guy got, 3-month suspension in municipal court, and you see that the 3 days after the sentence was imposed, he was out there taking a chance driving, and the cops grab him. That's a really easy call for you to make, because you see that he's on the revoked list for that purpose. The problem that you run into, especially in 39-340 matters, is that it's cascading in the sense that all of the penalties that you get for driving on the revoked list are cumulative, okay? And this is why this becomes so important. You start off with the basic penalties, all right? Is this a first offense for your guy, a second offense, a third offense? Remember, it's a third offense, he's got to get 10 days in jail and a $1,000 fine, okay? It's a second offense, I think he gets a $500 or $750, I forget what it is, $750 fine, and between 1 and 5 days in jail. And for first offense, it's a $500 fine. They all carry an additional suspension of up to 6 months, okay? So that's the first peg that your client has to deal with. The second part of this cascade is the normal driving on the revoked list as a result of a DWI under 39-340 F2. And again, over and above everything else, there's a jail term associated with it and an additional license suspension that is cumulative. It gets added on to whatever the first penalties were. Then, on top of all that, there's a third level of penalties if your guy is driving in a school zone. And you get extra penalties on top of the first two if your guy is driving within a school zone. Again, within 1,000 feet of a school zone. It's interesting because the legislature got rid of the school zone for the DWI and the refusal, but for some reason they kept the school zone for driving on the revoked list. The point I'm trying to make to everybody here is this is why this becomes so serious very, very quickly, even if it never gets indicted, is that you have 3 levels of penalties. The basic penalties, then on top of that, you get the regular driving on the revoked list as a result of being on the revoked list for DWI. And then if they charge your guy with a school zone offense, you get that as a third level of penalties. They're all cumulative, okay? So you got to explain to your clients when you're in that situation, you got a lot to deal with, all right? That's why it's so important that you be able to ascertain whether that element of driving on the revoked list during this period of suspension for DWI is in play. Now, the second permutation for this is that your guy received a determinate term of a suspension, which he has served, but he has never been restored. His suspension is continuing. Now, that could be for a whole lot of reasons. Let's say, didn't pay his restoration fee, which is very common, fell behind on his surcharges, didn't go to the IDRC. And there's all kinds of reasons why he would remain on the revoked list, and he could be on the revoked list indefinitely. I mean, some people, in my experience, have been on there for years. Many people, especially when I was doing public defender work, they get a DWI conviction. That is the end of their ability to ever drive legally in New Jersey again, because they can't come up with the money to pay for the surcharges and all the other associated costs with a drunk driving conviction. So they just kind of stay on the revoked list indefinitely. But this is the second possibility. Your client has completed the determinate term of the suspension, 3 months, a year, 2 years, whatever it was. But he stays on the revoked list and gets caught driving on the revoked list following the determinate term of the license suspension. And we'll talk about that momentarily. Next, stacked suspensions, all right? Your client is convicted of a DWI, and he's going to get a DWI suspension. But he's already on the revoked list for something else. It could be for surcharges. It could be for prior driving on the revoked list, no insurance. It could be for anything, okay? He may have one or multiple suspensions that he's currently serving, and he has not yet begun to serve the DWI suspension. Stacked suspensions addresses the issue where your client is being sentenced to a license suspension for drunk driving, but that suspension is going to run after he's got suspensions that have been imposed that are not drunk driving suspensions, okay? How does that get treated in the law? And we'll talk about that momentarily. And finally, very important, post-conviction relief issues. You will have situations where attorneys will go back or have gone back in the past and attacked collaterally a prior drunk driving conviction of some kind and gotten it eliminated. How does that impact on driving on the revoked list for drunk driving when you've gone back in time and eliminated a prior offense through PCR, okay? Again, you're going to see that the case law addresses each one of these permutations in detail. So let's kind of get into it. Let's talk about the easy call cascading mess. So, okay, let me read your notes to you, then we'll have a little discussion on this. It says here in your lesson plan, the defendant was personally operating during the determinate term of a DWI refusal license suspension ordered by the court. The judgment of conviction will have the precise date that the suspension began and its length in terms of the months, days, and years. The beginning date can be easily ascertained by the O code on the certified driving abstract, okay? So you get your client's abstract and you look for two things, V and the O. V means the violation date, and that is proof that there was a conviction, okay? Sometimes in driving on the revoked list, judges make mistakes, and you'll see a V date without any associated O date, and that simply means that the judge accepted a plea of guilty and sentenced the guy to whatever he sentenced him to for driving on the revoked list, but didn't impose a mandatory term of license suspension. So every once in a while, you'll see a V without the O. In counting the number of suspensions, or excuse me, prior offenses your guy has for driving on the revoked list, count the V's. Every V on the abstract is proof that there was a conviction for driving on the revoked list. Now, the O code is important only to a certain extent because it tells you the date that the suspension began. That's the order of suspension, and that's the date that the judge sentenced your client to some determinate term of license loss, okay? The problem you run into is that you don't know when it ended. And in order to represent your client, you got to figure that out. Knowing the starting point is perfectly fine, but it's critically important to know when the end was as well. The only way to know that for sure is to contact the court and either get a disposition letter that shows exactly what the dates were associated with this, or get a copy of the back of the ticket. I mean, it requires some intervention with you and the judiciary in order to be really positive about when the suspension was over. You've got to have that piece of information, all right? It says in your notes here, first offense during this window of driving on the revoked list triggers cumulative enhancements, which we just talked about a moment ago, for not only the regular penalties you get for driving on the revoked list, the penalties you get for being on the revoked list for drunk driving, but also if you're in a school zone, driving on the revoked list for drunk driving, and you're in a school zone on top of it. The 39340 conviction for a DWI suspension will also trigger a potential prosecution for 2C40-26. This is under the A section. If the defendant gets caught a second time driving on the revoked list during the window of the determinate suspension term, okay? Now, under 2C40-26A, this requires some jail term, but it does not say how long it has to be. It does not specify that it has to be done with parole and eligibility. It just indicates that you have to get some type of jail sentence, unspecified in the statute. So if you have a client who's pleading guilty to driving on the revoked list as a result of a DWI, okay, now he's pleading guilty, he's getting his penalties. If he gets caught a second time for driving on the revoked list, remember, he's still got one drunk driving conviction, but if he gets caught a second time for driving on the revoked list during that same suspension period, then he's got a 2C40-26A. And again, it's a crime of the fourth degree. It's got to be handled up in Superior Court. And there is an unspecified jail term that's associated with it. It's always been interesting to me that if the, I'll tell you my theory on this. I don't know how it's worked out in practice, but there's no license suspension associated with 2C40-26. You go to jail and you get a fine. You're treated as, fourth degree crime, but there's no statutory suspension of driving privileges. And I told you a moment ago that the 39340 should merge as a lesser included offense. However, the case law in New Jersey is very specific about merged offenses. This comes up a lot in the drunk driving context, where you have an aggravated assault or an aggravated manslaughter or something of that nature, vehicular homicide, assault by auto. And many times the defendant will be found guilty by the Superior Court judge of drunk driving, and that conviction will merge into the greater included offense that's criminal. However, the penalties survive the merger. Technically, your client is supposed to lose his driver's license under 39340 and get the 39340 fines and motor vehicle surcharges for the merged offense of 39340, even though he's found guilty of the greater included offense of the 2C40-26. So if you have, and I hope you never do, but if you have this situation with a client, you've got to prepare your client to say, look, if the judge knows what he's doing, you're going to wind up having to face the penalties for the 39-340, even though it's going to merge as a lesser included offense into the 2C40-26A. Okay, keep that in mind when you're telling your guy that you've got to get him ready for sentencing, because it becomes a very nasty surprise for your client, and that will also enable the Superior Court judge to impose some license suspension in the context of 39-340 sentencing, because it's authorized under the offense that's going to be merged into the greater included offense. That's how people should lose their license for 2C40-26. I don't think the legislature thought about this when they enacted the statute, but that's how these things should work with merged offenses. The penalties on the merged offense survive the merger. All right. And it indicates here, finally, 2 or more convictions at any time for DWI or refusal, coupled with operation during the window of the DWI suspension, will trigger 2C40-26B. Okay. You know, in DWI matters, you get a step down after 10 years, and you get that through statutorily through the driving on the revoke, for drunk driving, and you get a step down through the case law for refusals. Okay. So you get a 10-year break up to a third offense. Beyond the third offense, you don't get any break. So if your third offense is more than 10 years after your second offense, third offense is considered a second offense. If your second offense is more than 10 years after your first offense, the second offense is treated as a first offense for sentencing purposes. What's interesting about 2C40-26B is the step down does not have anything to do with your liability for the fourth degree crime. You could have had a prior DWI, 15 or 20 years ago, and then one of more recent vintage, and notwithstanding the fact that you might have gotten a step down, that's not going to save you if you drive in that window and it's as a result of a second violation. You're subject to 2C40-26B. Again, fourth degree crime, 6 months in jail mandatory. And I have a comment here that says the defense to the situation, especially with the 2C40-26B, where you're trying to get rid of one of the priors, that's where you're going to get a lot of post-conviction relief applications, especially now because of State versus Zingis, where some of the offenses are going to be very easy to get rid of if they involved tests that were administered within the period of time between 2008 and 2016, and it took place in one of the 5 counties where Trooper Dennis was operating. Those convictions are all subject to being reviewed and probably pretty much automatically vacated. So, but that you may have other grounds for post-conviction relief, but that's really going to be your best defense in these types of cases where your client is driving on the revoked list and you can't get out of that. So what you're trying to do is attack one of the prior convictions to keep him from getting indicted. All right. Okay. Now, the next one is DWI suspension is over. In other words, you've served the determinate term, but your client is still on the revoked list. Why? Well, he didn't pay his $100 surcharge. He didn't go to the IDRC or didn't successfully complete the IDRC, or the IDRC says, we want him to, don't restore his license, we want him to do 16 weeks of therapy. He didn't pay his surcharges, or he still owes fine payments. If it was a second offense, he might have had a community service obligation associated with it, okay? It could be any one of these things and a whole bunch more that keep him on the revoked list indefinitely, because these are all indefinite suspensions. And the Motor Vehicle Commission will not restore his driving privileges. So the license suspension for the determined term of the license suspension is over, but he remains on the revoked list. This situation was addressed in a very important appellate division case called State versus Perry. And we'll talk about Perry in a couple seconds about what it means, but it was extremely significant for the police. And it's very significant for you as defense attorneys and for those of you who are prosecutors out there. Is Howard Egenberg here, by the way?